The crunch of glass under her massive SUV tires was the only sound that could be heard as Sharon Wilkins glared triumphantly at the shattered remains of her neighbor's driveway lights. Little did she know, a storm was brewing, one that would unleash a torrent of consequences she could never have imagined. Staring out the window, Mark Thomas gripped the ledge until his knuckles turned white. There they were again, the flattened, lifeless lights that had once illuminated his driveway. For months, his HOA-obsessed neighbor, Sharon, had been relentlessly crushing them under the weight of her massive Escalade, claiming they violated some obscure community guideline. "This has to stop," Mark muttered through gritted teeth, his jaw clenched with fury. He had tried reasoning with Sharon, pleading for her cooperation, but she remained unyielding, her eyes cold and uncompromising. The final straw had been when she bulldozed over the new lights he just installed, leaving nothing but shards of shattered glass. Enough was enough. Mark's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone and began frantically searching for the most powerful industrial-grade driveway lights money could buy. If Sharon wanted a war, then a war she would get. The next day, Mark stood proudly in his driveway, admiring the towering, high-intensity LED fixtures that now illuminated the area. They were bright enough to outshine the sun, and he couldn't wait to see the look on Sharon's face when she tried to run them over. Sure enough, as the Escalade approached, Mark could see Sharon's eyes widen in shock. She slowed down, squinting against the blinding light, but there was no mistaking the determination etched on her features. With a defiant huff, she gunned the engine and plowed straight ahead. Thud. The massive SUV lurched to a halt, its front end crumpled against the unforgiving fixtures. Sharon stared in disbelief, her manicured hands gripping the steering wheel in a white-knuckled grip. Mark strode over to the car, his expression a mixture of triumph and barely contained rage. "Looks like your little game is up, Sharon," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "From now on, you'll think twice before crushing my property." Sharon's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and fury. "This is outrageous," she screeched, fumbling for the door handle. "I'm going to the HOA board, and you're going to pay for this." "Go ahead," Mark replied coolly, stepping back to allow her to exit the vehicle. "But I'd be careful if I were you. These lights are designed to withstand the impact of a tank. I'd hate for you to end up with more than just a dented bumper." As Sharon stormed off, muttering dire threats under her breath, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. He had finally put an end to her relentless campaign of destruction. Little did he know, however, that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would test the limits of his patience and the strength of his resolve. The next morning, Mark awoke to the sound of muffled voices outside his front door. Peering through the window, he groaned inwardly as he spotted a small crowd gathering on his lawn. Sharon, the HOA president, and a few other neighbors, all sporting stern expressions. Steeling himself, Mark opened the door and stepped outside, his gaze unwavering as he met their accusatory stares. "What is the meaning of this, Mark?" the HOA president, Mrs. Wilkins, demanded, her voice dripping with indignation. "We've received multiple complaints about those monstrosities you've installed in your driveway." Mark crossed his arms over his chest, refusing to be cowed. "Those monstrosities are perfectly within the guidelines of our community regulations," he retorted. "They're designed to withstand any accidental damage, unlike the flimsy lights Sharon kept destroying." Sharon's face contorted with outrage. "Accidental damage," she spat. "That was no accident, and you know it. You deliberately installed those lights to spite me, and now you're endangering the entire neighborhood." Mark felt his temper flare. "Endangering the neighborhood? Don't be ridiculous, Sharon. These lights are perfectly safe. They're just brighter than your average porch light. If you had a problem with them, you should have come to me first instead of taking matters into your own hands." The HOA president raised a hand, silencing the bickering neighbors. "Be that as it may, Mark, The fact remains that these lights are disruptive and unsightly. The board has decided that they need to be removed immediately. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. Removed? You can't be serious. I followed every single regulation to the letter. We're making an exception in this case, Mrs. Wilkins replied, her tone brooking no argument. You have until the end of the week to take them down, or will be forced to take legal action. With that, the group turned and marched back towards their homes, leaving Mark seething with rage and frustration. How dare they try to strong-arm him into removing the lights he'd installed to protect his own property? This was war, and he had no intention of backing down. Clenching his fists, Mark stormed back into the house, his mind racing as he plotted his next move. If the HOA thought they could bully him into submission, they had another thing coming. This was his home, his driveway, and he was going to fight tooth and nail to keep it that way. The stage was set for a showdown, and Mark was determined to come out on top. The rest of the week passed in a blur of tension and anxiety for Mark. He spent countless hours poring over the HOA's regulations, searching for any loophole or technicality that could save his high-intensity driveway lights. Each day, he half expected to find a notice taped to his front door, demanding that he comply with the board's order. But no such notice ever materialized, and the lights continued to shine defiantly into the night. As the deadline loomed, Mark knew he had to act fast. He couldn't afford to lose this battle, not when he had invested so much time and money into ensuring the safety and security of his own home. Steeling his nerves, Mark decided to confront the HOA president, Mrs. Wilkins, directly. He marched up to her doorstep, his jaw set with determination. "Mrs. Wilkins, we need to talk," he said, his voice tense but polite. The older woman eyed him warily, her lips pursed in a thin line. "What is it now, Mark? I thought I made myself quite clear the other day." "With all due respect, ma'am, you haven't," Mark replied, refusing to back down. "Those lights are perfectly within the guidelines, and I have the documentation to prove it. I'm not taking them down, and I'd appreciate it if you and the board would reconsider your decision." Mrs. Wilkins let out an exasperated sigh. "Mark, you're being unreasonable. Those lights are a nuisance, and they're disrupting the entire neighborhood. The board has made its decision, and it's final." "But," Mark began, only to be cut off by a sharp wave of the woman's hand. "No buts," she snapped. "If you refuse to remove the lights, we'll be forced to take legal action. And trust me, you don't want to go down that road." Mark felt his blood boil with indignation. Legal action? Over some driveway lights? This is ridiculous, Mrs. Wilkins, and you know it. "Ridiculous or not, those are the rules," the HOA president replied, her tone unyielding. "You have until the end of the week, Mark. I suggest you start planning how you're going to take them down." With that, she turned on her heel and disappeared back into her house, leaving Mark standing on the doorstep, his fists clenched in frustration. He had to find a way to fight this, to prove that he was in the right. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the odds were stacked against him. The HOA had the power, the resources, and the backing of the entire community. As the sun set, casting long shadows across his driveway, Mark felt a sense of dread settle in the pit of his stomach. He had to come up with a plan, and fast, if he wanted to keep his high-powered lights shining bright. As the deadline loomed, Mark found himself growing increasingly desperate. He had spent countless hours scouring the HOA's bylaws, searching for any loophole or technicality that could save his beloved driveway lights, but to no avail. The more he delved into the legalese, the more he realized that the HOA had the upper hand. They were within their rights to demand the removal of the lights, and they had the full backing of the community to enforce their decision. Mark paced back and forth in his living room, his mind racing. He couldn't give up, not when he had invested so much time and money into ensuring the safety and security of his home. But the thought of the HOA taking legal action filled him with dread. Suddenly, an idea struck him. What if he could enlist the help of his neighbors? Surely they couldn't all be as fanatical about the HOA's rules as Sharon and Mrs. Wilkins. Perhaps he could rally them to his cause, appealing to their sense of fairness and reason. Without hesitation, Mark began drafting a letter, outlining his side of the story, and making a passionate plea for their support. He painstakingly addressed each envelope, taking care to include every household on the street. The next day, Mark spent the entire afternoon going door to door, handing out the letters and engaging his neighbors in conversations. Some were hesitant, citing their fear of the HOA's repercussions, but others listened with open minds, their expressions softening as they heard Mark's side of the story. As the sun began to set, Mark returned home, a glimmer of hope flickering in his chest. He had planted the seeds, and now all he could do was wait and see if they would take root. The following day, Mark awoke to the sound of voices outside his door. Peering through the window, he was stunned to see a small crowd of neighbors gathered on his lawn, their expressions a mix of determination and solidarity. Heart pounding, Mark rushed outside, his eyes widening in disbelief. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. One of the neighbors, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, stepped forward, a resolute look on her face. "Mark, we've all been talking, and we decided that we're not going to let the HOA bully you into taking down those lights," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. Mark felt a surge of relief and gratitude wash over him. You mean it?" he asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Absolutely," Sarah replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Those lights are a safety feature, and we're not going to let the HOA trample all over our rights. We're with you, Mark." As the other neighbors voiced their agreement, Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He'd have found unexpected allies in the most unlikely of places, and together they would stand up to the HOA's tyranny. The stage was set for a showdown, and Mark was no longer alone in the fight. The next day, Mark awoke to the sound of commotion outside his home. Peering through the window, he was met with a sight that made his heart skip a beat. The entire neighborhood had gathered on his lawn, their faces etched with determination. Stepping outside, Mark was greeted by a chorus of voices, all rallying to his cause. "We're with you, Mark. Those lights are a safety feature, and we're not going to let the HOA take them down. This is our neighborhood, and we have a right to protect our homes." Mark felt a surge of pride and gratitude wash over him. He had never expected such an outpouring of support, and it gave him the strength to face the impending confrontation with the HOA. As if on cue, the sound of an approaching car caught their attention, and they all turned to see Sharon's massive Escalade rolling up the street. The SUV came to a screeching halt, and Sharon herself emerged, her face contorted with rage. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, her eyes darting from one neighbor to the next. Sarah, the middle-aged woman who had spoken up earlier, stepped forward, her chin held high. "We're standing up for Mark and his driveway lights, Sharon. The entire neighborhood is behind him, and we're not going to let the HOA trample all over our rights." Sharon's nostrils flared, and she opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, another car pulled up, and Mrs. Wilkins, the HOA president, stepped out, her expression grim. "What is the meaning of this circus?" she demanded, her gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd. Mark steeled himself, determined to face his adversaries head-on. "We're here to tell you that we're not going to let you take down my driveway lights, Mrs. Wilkins," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "These lights are a safety feature, and they're well within the HOA's guidelines. We're not going to back down, and we're prepared to fight this all the way." The HOA president's eyes narrowed, and she turned to Sharon, a silent exchange passing between them. Then she stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Very well, Mark," she said, her tone measured and controlled. "We'll reevaluate the situation and get back to you. In the meantime, I'd suggest you keep those lights on." With that, she turned and marched back to her car, Sharon trailing behind her like a sullen child. The neighbors erupted into cheers, their elation palpable. Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. He had stood his ground, and with the support of his community, he had managed to stare down the HOA's intimidation tactics. But he knew that the battle was far from over, and that he would need to remain vigilant in the days to come. In the days that followed, an uneasy truce settled over the neighborhood. The HOA had yet to make a definitive decision on Mark's driveway lights, and the residents remained on high alert, ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. Mark, for his part, was torn between relief and trepidation. He knew that the HOA's silence was likely a calculated move, a calm before the storm. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the air became palpable. The neighbors continued to gather regularly, discussing strategy and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. They were united in their determination to protect Mark's rights, but they also knew that the HOA had the power and resources to make their lives very difficult. One evening, as Mark was preparing dinner, his phone suddenly buzzed with a message from Sarah, the neighbor who had stood up to the HOA alongside him. "They're coming," the message read, "and they're bringing lawyers." Mark's heart raced as he hastily grabbed his coat and rushed out the door. Sure enough, as he approached the end of his driveway, he could see the familiar sight of Sharon's Escalade, flanked by two sleek, black SUVs. The HOA president, Mrs. Wilkins, stood amongst them, her expression grim and unyielding. "Mark Thomas," she declared, her voice carrying across the silent street, "we've reached a decision regarding your driveway lights." Mark swallowed hard, bracing himself for the worst. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors upon him, their silent support a steadying presence. After careful consideration, Mrs. Wilkins continued, "The HOA board has determined that your lights are a violation of the community guidelines. They pose a safety hazard and must be removed immediately." A murmur of outrage rippled through the gathered crowd, but Mrs. Wilkins raised a hand, silencing them. "Furthermore," she went on, "we've been advised by our legal counsel that any attempt to interfere with the HOA's decision will result in immediate legal action." Mark felt his stomach drop. He had known that the HOA had the upper hand, but he had never imagined they would go to such lengths to enforce their will. The threat of legal action hung in the air, a looming specter that threatened to crush the very foundation of his resistance. Sensing his hesitation, Sharon stepped forward, a triumphant grin plastered on her face. "You see, Mark," she sneered, "I told you that you wouldn't get away with this. Now, be a good neighbor and take down those lights before we have to take even more drastic measures." Mark clenched his fists, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out of this impossible situation. He knew that he couldn't give in, not after everything he had fought for. But the thought of facing the full force of the HOA's legal might was enough to make his knees tremble. As the standoff continued, Mark knew that he was running out of options. The fate of his driveway lights, and perhaps even his home, hung in the balance. The question was, would he have the courage to keep fighting, or would he be forced to surrender? The tension in the air was palpable as Mark faced off against the formidable HOA contingent. On one side stood Mrs. Wilkins, the HOA president, flanked by her team of lawyers, their expressions cold and unyielding. On the other, Mark had the unwavering support of his neighbors, their faces etched with determination. Mark knew that he was outmatched, both in resources and legal expertise. The HOA had the upper hand, and they were making it abundantly clear that they were willing to use every tool at their disposal to enforce their will. But as he looked into the faces of his neighbors, Mark felt a surge of resolve. These were the people he had fought for, the ones who had stood by him when he needed them most. He couldn't back down now, not when so much was at stake. Squaring his shoulders, Mark stepped forward, his voice steady and unwavering. "I'm not taking down those lights," he declared, his gaze sweeping across the assembled group. "They're perfectly within the HOA guidelines, and I have the documentation to prove it." Mrs. Wilkins' eyes narrowed, and she nodded to one of the lawyers, who stepped forward, brandishing a thick stack of papers. "That may be true, Mr. Thomas," the lawyer said, his tone dripping with condescension, "but the board has deemed these lights to be a safety hazard and a violation of the community's aesthetics. We have the legal authority to demand their removal, and we're prepared to take this matter to court if necessary." The crowd erupted in a chorus of protests, but the lawyer raised a hand, silencing them. "I'd advise you all to step back and let the proper authorities handle this," he said, his eyes sweeping across the gathered neighbors. Mark felt his heart racing, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He knew that he was fighting an uphill battle, but he refused to back down. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. Mustering every ounce of courage, Mark stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "If you think I'm going to roll over and let you bully me, you're sorely mistaken," he said, his voice laced with defiance. "I have the support of this entire neighborhood, and we're prepared to fight you every step of the way." The lawyer's expression darkened, and he turned to Mrs. Wilkins, muttering something under his breath. The HOA president nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Very well, Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "We'll see you in court." With that, the HOA contingent turned and marched back to their vehicles, leaving Mark and his neighbors standing in a tense silence. As the SUVs disappeared down the street, Mark felt a sense of both relief and dread. He had stood his ground, but he knew that the battle was far from over. The prospect of a costly legal battle loomed large, but he was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. With the support of his neighbors by his side, Mark knew that he had a fighting chance. But the road ahead was rocky, and he couldn't help but wonder if he had the strength to emerge victorious. As the weeks turned into months, the legal battle between Mark and the HOA raged on. The courtroom had become a battleground, with both sides vying for the upper hand. Mark's neighbors remained steadfast in their support, rallying together to help cover the mounting legal fees. The HOA, led by the ever-persistent Sharon and the unyielding Mrs. Wilkins, pulled out all the stops. They hired a team of high-powered attorneys who seemed hell-bent on burying Mark in a mountain of paperwork and legal technicalities. But Mark refused to back down. With the unwavering support of his community, he fought tooth and nail, determined to protect his rights and the safety of his home. The arguments in the courtroom grew heated, with both sides presenting their case with fervor. The judge, a stern-faced man who seemed to relish the theatrics, listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived, and the courtroom fell silent as the judge rose to deliver his decision. After carefully reviewing the evidence and the arguments presented by both parties, the judge began, his voice booming through the hushed chamber. "I have come to the conclusion that the HOA's demands for the removal of Mr. Thomas' driveway lights are unjustified and a violation of his rights as a homeowner." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, and Mark felt a surge of relief and triumph wash over him. He had done it. He had beaten the HOA at their own game, and he had done it with the unwavering support of his community. As the judge continued to deliver his ruling, outlining in detail the flaws in the HOA's case, Mark couldn't help but steal a glance at Sharon and Mrs. Wilkins. Their faces were twisted with a mix of shock and disbelief, and he couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. In the end, the judge's decision was unequivocal. The driveway lights were to remain, and the HOA was ordered to pay a substantial sum in legal fees and damages. It was a resounding victory, not just for Mark, but for the entire neighborhood. As the courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, Mark found himself surrounded by his neighbors, their faces alight with joy and pride. They had fought a hard-won battle, and they had emerged victorious. Looking out over the sea of familiar faces, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was his community, his home, and he would do whatever it took to protect it, even if it meant taking on the formidable forces of the HOA. From that day forward, the driveway lights continued to shine brightly, a testament to the power of community and the unwavering spirit of those who refused to be silenced.